Good morning, everyone. My name is William, and I'll be presenting my findings from a study on brain stroke today. To be more precise, I'll be exploring the different variables that could increase one's chances of developing brain stroke and suggest how we can improve our chances of keeping it at bay. So these are the contents of my presentation today, and I'll start off by explaining what a brain stroke is. Then I'll proceed on to compare the relationship between different variables and brain stroke, and then I'll end off my presentation with a conclusion. So first off, what is a brain stroke? Well, a brain stroke occurs when something blocks the blood supply to a certain part of the brain, or when a blood vessel in the brain bursts. In either case, parts of the brain become damaged or die. Such an event can lead to a lasting brain damage, long-term disability, or even death. So first off, let's compare the brain stroke cases between rural and urban areas. So as you can see over here, in urban areas, generally the number of people getting brain stroke increases with age. In particular, those aged between 75 to 79 make up the highest number of those with brain stroke. In rural areas, the trend is similar in that as people age, more of them start developing brain stroke, and those aged between 75 to 79 make up the bulk of this group. On the whole, we can see that people in urban areas had higher incidences of brain stroke than people in rural areas. In fact, 16.4% more people in urban residences suffer brain stroke than those in the rural residences. Now let's look at the distribution of brain stroke cases among different genders based on residence type. So in urban residents, we can generally see that women tend to be more susceptible to brain stroke than men. In fact, the only age categories where men outnumbered women in developing brain stroke are between 55 to 59 years old and 60 to 64 years old. In rural areas, the similar trend follows, where more women develop brain stroke than men. The data reflects that only men aged between 45 to 49 years old, as well as 55 to 65 years old, had more cases of brain stroke than women of the same age groups. In both cases, we can see that women tend to develop brain stroke earlier than men too. A possible reason for this could be pregnancy. Women who develop pre-eclampsia or eclampsia, which is a hypertension disorder during pregnancy, double their chances of getting a brain stroke for years after pregnancy. Now let's look at the relationship between BMI, average glucose level, and brain stroke. Over here, you can see a green box, and this is the intersection between healthy BMI score and healthy glucose level. So in urban males that have stroke, we can see that their glucose level cluster in either the low healthy glucose level or the higher end of the diabetic level. On the other hand, urban males without stroke tend to have their glucose levels concentrated in the healthier range. For both groups, their BMI scores tend to cluster between 25 and 35. We can also see that there is a significantly higher proportion of urban males without stroke having both healthy glucose level and healthy BMI scores as compared to urban men with stroke. For urban females with stroke, their glucose levels also tend to group under either the lower region or the upper or the diabetic level. And for urban females without stroke, their glucose levels are heavily concentrated in the healthier levels. And for both groups, their BMI scores tend to cluster around 25 and 35 as well. So as with the males, there's a higher proportion of urban females without stroke in having both healthy BMI scores and glucose levels as compared to urban females with stroke. So in the interest of time, I'll just highlight that the same trend was observed in the rural population. And in a nutshell, both rural and urban areas saw BMI scores of those with stroke being very similar to those without stroke. However, it is evident that there are more stroke-negative subjects with healthier glucose levels than stroke-positive subjects. Now, this could indicate that one's glucose level is a significant factor in determining one's chances of developing brain stroke. And we know that stress is a very negative thing for our body, and it causes many illnesses. And one source of stress will be our work. So let's look at the relationship between brain stroke and different types of work. So for males that have stroke compared to males that do not have stroke, the majority of them are working in the private sector. And then this is followed by self-employment and then government sector. For females who have stroke versus those who do not have stroke, most of them are also employed in the private sector, followed by self-employment and government sector. So we see that the proportion of participants in different work types for both males and females are similar, and therefore we can confidently say that the type of work does not contribute significantly to one's chances of suffering a stroke. Now let's compare the relationship between the brain stroke and other diseases. For both genders, the proportion of those who did not have a stroke having hypertension is much lower than those who had a stroke. And for both genders, among those that did not have a stroke, there is a much lower proportion of them having heart disease than those who had a stroke. So we can hypothesize that having hypertension and heart disease significantly increases one's chances of getting a stroke. In this graph, the red area represents instances where those who had a stroke had a higher glucose level than those who did not have a stroke, and the opposite is true for the blue area. Comparing the sheer difference in the red area against the blue area, we can hypothesize that having diabetes can substantially increase our chances of getting a stroke. In fact, 140 milligram per deciliter is the cutoff point for having diabetes, and we see that only those who had a stroke had crossed this threshold. So I calculated the association score between different variables with stroke, and I found that the top three factors are the age, the average glucose level, and hypertension and heart disease. Now let's look at the three factors that are closely related to heart disease. Why heart disease? Well, heart diseases such as heart failure and arrhythmia are some of the types that are associated with stroke. So it is in our best interest to maintain our heart to be in its tip-top healthy condition. So the top three factors closely related to heart disease are age, diabetes, and smoking. While we cannot do much about our age or the aging process, let's focus on the diabetes and smoking. So for those who have heart disease, there are 22% more diabetic people in this group as compared to those who do not have heart disease. In other words, 33% of those who have heart disease are diabetic, and only 11% of those who do not have heart disease are diabetic. This is because high blood glucose can damage your blood vessels and the nerves that control your heart and blood vessels. Over time, this damage can lead to heart disease. Now let's look at the relationship between heart disease and smoking. So among those who have heart disease, 58.6% of them are smokers. But for those who do not have heart disease, 60.4% of them are non-smokers. This is because chemicals in cigarette smoke cause the cells that line blood vessels to become swollen and inflamed. This can narrow the blood vessels and can lead to many cardiovascular diseases. Lastly, let's look at how cholesterol levels differ between genders for different stages of the heart disease. Just so you know, there are 4 stages of heart disease, with stage 0 being a healthy heart. So the purple half represents women and the green half represents men. And as you can see, as the stage of heart disease continues to worsen, the median cholesterol level of women generally increased. However, the median cholesterol of men remain near the healthy level. So when compared against each other, the interquartile range of the cholesterol level, which are bounded by these dashed lines, of women always remain higher than those of men at every stage of the heart disease, except for stage 3. So overall, my hypothesis is that the cholesterol levels affect women's chances of developing or worsening their heart disease much more significantly than men's. For men, there could be other variables that are at play that have heavier impacts on their chances of getting or even worsening their heart disease. In conclusion, we have seen that age, hypertension, heart disease, and average glucose levels are significant players that contribute to one's likelihood of getting a stroke. So while we are helpless in stopping or even slowing down our aging process, we can adopt a healthier lifestyle and a healthier diet to reduce our chances of getting a stroke. For instance, we can avoid smoking, eating salty, sugary, or fatty food, and exercising regularly to ensure our blood vessels do not get clogged up with plaque. By following these suggestions, we can be more assured of not suffering a stroke as we continue to age into our golden years. Thank you for your attention.